This is Tommy's Outdoors 90. I always love episodes when I get to talk to people from different parts of the world. And this is what's going to happen in this episode. Our guest is a young scientist and hunter, Matt Gould, and we talk about American black bear. Matt spent some time researching black bear and wrote several papers. And that was the species that I wanted to learn the most and talk about it the most, especially that spring black bear hunt is one of the hunts on my bucket list. But in this episode, we really not talk only about hunting. We talk about a lot about ecology and biology of black bears, as well as we touch on many social and here I say political aspects related to black bears and bears in general, conflict with bears or human-wildlife conflict. And from there we go broader into discussing conservation and ecology and the current situation in the world with climate change and biodiversity loss and how these things are being seen and acted upon in United States. We also talk about birds of prey and what impact wind farms have on birds of prey. So we really started with birds of prey, this episode of the podcast, and then we continued with black bear like we planned. And also we talk in this podcast about North American model of wildlife conservation, which is, without a doubt, one of the most successful models in the world. And with that, before I leave you to enjoy this episode of the podcast, just quick reminder, if you're watching this video on YouTube, leave the thumbs up. And if you're listening to audio version only, please rate this podcast, give it 5 stars, leave the comment. These sort of interactions always helping me and helping the podcast. And now, without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, American black bear and Matt Gould. Matt, thank you for doing this. Welcome to Tommy's Outdoors.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Listen, I try to have a guest from different countries and different continents, but I think you're only second guest from the United States. So,
nice.
Welcome.
I feel honored.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, as just for our listeners, can you briefly tell us, what you do, what is your research that you do? And, I straight away follow up with the second question is because you're obviously in your bio, you said I'm a researcher, I'm a scientist, but you're also a hunter. And for Tommy's Outdoors it's fantastic because I cover outdoors activities, hunting, fishing, hiking, but also environmental stuff, let's say it, conservation, habitat protection, rewilding, if you like, and so on and so forth. So it's always great to have a marine biologist and angler in one person. So I'm really happy that I have you here. So can you tell us, what's your research, what you do, and whether your interest as a hunter, is it kind of connected with your research, or is it kind of like a separate thing? Is it not that much connected?
Right. So I grew up in Montana, so Northwest United States. I went to school at the University of Montana. I got a bachelor's in wildlife biology, and then I did my PhD down at New Mexico State University, so in the Southwest U.S., down in the desert. And my PhD covered monitoring American black bear populations in the Southwest using non-invasive methods, so primarily genetic-based methods. And my dissertation looked at estimating density of black bears in a couple ranges, and those density estimates were used by the state's Game and Fish Agency to set harvest limits. And then I also did some kind of more Oh, not necessarily theoretical, but proving that you could use a statistical paradigm in a certain way based under certain conditions. And that kind of looked at habitat use. And then my last chapter was a population and landscape genetics study. So we tried to say, okay, we have all these black bear populations in the Southwest, and they're isolated in it's called Sky Island mountain ranges. So you have the desert across the Southwest region, and then you have these mountain ranges that kind of rise up, and they're high elevation, and you get, kind of alpine or temperate alpine conditions depending on how high they go up. And so you have these species that are kind of isolated on little islands. And so we wanted to say, okay, let's sample all of them. Let's see who's genetically related, group them into genetic clusters. And then from that kind of figure out, well, we know we see some kind of gene flow going back and forth. Well, what landscape features are either promoting or inhibiting gene flow between those populations? After I finished my dissertation, I'm now a postdoc research scientist, still at New Mexico State, but I primarily work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service got a lot of like subheadings here. So Fish and Wildlife Service, but I work within the National Raptor Program that's focused on work related to raptors in the U.S., so birds of prey. And then I am doing two things. One, I'm part of the National Eagle Support Team, and that team is tasked with providing technical assistance to the various administrative regions on estimating the take of bald and golden eagles relative to wind energy. So there's a few acts in the U.S. One's the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. The other's the Migratory Bird Act that limits or makes it illegal for you to kill an eagle. But unfortunately, things happen. Birds run into buildings. But we also have wind energy, and wind energy is the source of mortality for eagles. And so there's a permitting process that we try and estimate how many eagles might be killed at a wind farm, so a permit can be kind of given, so they have to do some research that allows us to estimate that, and then give them a kind of a permit that allows them to take, but with some conditions that they offset those mortalities somewhere else. So it's trying to wind energy as we move towards non-renewables is important, but even non-renewable energy still has wildlife conflicts. And so it's how can we best try and minimize those?
Yeah. Quick question here. How do you offset mortality?
Yeah. So obviously eagles or really anything can die a number of ways, right? And a lot of times natural mortality isn't necessarily the largest source of mortality. And so for eagle species, a huge source of mortality is electrocution on power lines. And so, you think about the miles and miles or kilometers and kilometers of power lines on the landscape, and some of those were, erected 100 years ago or 50 years ago or 70 even. And so they may not be the safest structures for birds. And so what can happen is you can try and retrofit those risky type of poles into something that's has a less likelihood of electrocution, in that sense would prevent electrocution, thus preventing mortalities of birds. So you identify high risk poles and populations, high risk populations, see where they overlap and whatnot, and try and offset it that way.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So essentially they have to do some work that will lower the mortality somewhere else, knowing that on their side the mortality will be whatever is estimated.
Right. And the wind companies can do a few other things on their own. There's some push into various they can do curtailment, which is trying to actively shut down wind turbines when there are threats like eagles in the area. There's one kind of, I guess, popular software system called Identiflight, which tries to it tries to, instead of having people out on the landscape, it tries to have a machine on the landscape that tries to identify eagles ahead of time off in the distance. So then it can, oh, an eagle's coming from this direction. We have these 2 turbines here. Let's shut those down.
Seriously? Wow.
Yeah, it's some pretty fancy software, and it's starting to be implemented at different projects, and they're trying to compare, how effective it is. But that's, it's a hard thing to kind of research, because you could have, on one hand, you could have reduced mortalities because of identify, or maybe you have it because there just weren't a bunch of eagles in the area that year. Yeah. And so it's a difficult thing to try and parse those 2 effects apart. So hopefully that research, a lot more research gets done on it, and we can really try and see how effective that method is.
That's very interesting, and I wasn't expecting that we were going to be talking about the eagles and effect. But I have a follow-up question since we on that. So, what is, like, in general, and I know, and I need to qualify for everybody who's watching that or listening, that we're talking about the United States, or more specifically region where you work. But maybe you know whether there are any implication or any approximation for other places in the world when the wind energy and wind farms are built. What is a overall percentage of or impact on mortality? Because if you look at the popular media, on one end you have people who say, like, oh, wind energy, it's bad for birds, there's huge mortality, endangered birds, raptors getting killed, and so on and so forth.
Right.
But then you have information like, yes, that's true, but then if you compare that with collision with cars, and it's a fraction of a percentage point. And so from your experience, from your perspective, is it significant mortality? Or is it, like, really, compared to other ways those birds die, it's, the benefits of transition to renewables are far outweigh potentially, a little bit increased mortality?
Yeah, that's a tricky question to navigate. So wind energy overall, it's like you discussed. Yes, it has mortality associated with it, but it's probably, if I'm recalling the various figures I've seen as well, it's not the leading cause of mortality, right? We have window strikes, electrocutions are huge, and actually it really, in some regions, the largest source of mortality is just simply, and sadly to say, people that are just driving around, they'll just shoot eagles off of fence posts or off of power lines.
So poaching.
So poaching is a huge source of mortality. For non-eagles, a lot of passerines and stuff, obviously cats, domestic cats are probably the leading cause of, or a huge cause of loss of biodiversity in general. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes I think, you'll see people that go, well, yeah, but trying to reduce mortality in all areas is a goal that we should always be pushing towards. I also think that, for some species, even relieving a little bit of mortality can be the difference between them, a population growth, stable, or decline. And then lastly, not everyone can equally affect or reduce mortality, right? For example, another source, and this is something maybe we can get into later with hunting, another source of mortality for eagles is the ingestion of lead ammunition from gut piles and carcasses, right? And so, like, I've seen this a lot where people that are opposed to transition towards copper ammunition or non-lead ammunition go, yeah, but that ammunition doesn't kill nearly as many birds as electrocutions do. And it's like, you're right, but I can't retrofit every hole that I go out and see, right? But I can easily try at least switch from a non-lead or a lead to a non-lead ammunition. So that's something I can control. For some species, like I said, this is, in the grand scheme of things, climate change is kind of the real thing that's going to be pushing all species towards, population decline potentially. But in the short term, we also need to address the immediate sources of mortality, and there's some populations where small changes do have an effect, like golden eagles or bald eagles are doing very well. They're a conservation success, poster child for the Endangered Species Act. Populations tanked because of DDT once DDT was outlawed. Raptor populations, bald eagle populations skyrocketed, and now bald eagles are doing very well. Golden eagles, on the other hand, are they're not doing as well. They're hovering around that area where they could be starting to trend downwards potentially. So we need to address anything we can. And then the last piece that I think sometimes I've had a lot of lastlies here, but another piece that is often overlooked is that sometimes things have to be addressed because it's the law to do so. Like, we could just completely ignore, the killing of eagles regardless of the source of mortality. But in the U.S., that is illegal. Therefore, the federal agency that's in charge of managing them could be brought to court by another group saying, hey, you're not upholding your duty to manage wildlife, which has been entrusted to you by the public. And that comes through, the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, as well as the Migratory Bird Act. Gotcha.
No, it's cool that you mentioned the lead ammunition, because that's also something I covered in length in a podcast in a number of episodes. Just one last question on the eagles, because I always try to draw parallels into what is happening in Ireland, United Kingdom, or broadly in Europe. And what drew my attention is the illegal persecution of birds of prey, which is it's a big problem in, for example, United Kingdom, also in Ireland. And you mentioned that the poaching, that the people just going and shooting eagles. Like, is there a reason? So, in other words, is this driven by some, let's say, interests like managing other wildlife or protecting other sheep or something, or is it just stupidity? Let's say people just wanted, look at that, I shot
a little bit of A, a little bit of B. Golden eagles do predate or prey upon sheep quite a bit, especially lambs. There's a famous study that occurred in Montana where Wildlife Services, it's an agency that helps try and reduce conflict between wildlife and livestock, either through non-lethal or lethal methods. And they're having a lot of issues with golden eagles killing lambs there. And so they were either killing, I can't remember. The study happened this was like 70s or 80s, somewhere in there. And so they were removing eagles, whether that was lethal or non-lethal, I can't remember. And what they found out is that's actually not doing anything, because most of the eagles were migrating through during winter or during the spring, heading north. And so there was just, new eagles coming in. How much that is, cause of mortality with ranching, I'm not sure. But I think a huge part of it also is just kind of, people being stupid and just shooting birds because they can shoot a bird. I know of one such story back home. One person was finally arrested because they would just be driving around the valley, just shooting hawks off of fence posts for no reason other than they just, they could. So, which is really hard to hear.
Yeah. Well, good they get arrested eventually. That's I guess a good part of that story. Okay, listen. So I just want to go back to where we started. So how are your hunting interest ties? Like, does it? So first question, like, does it tie in any way to your work? other than like a general foundation of obviously you're interested in the wildlife, you're interested in the natural environment, and this is like one of the things that is on that foundation, or is it like more connection for you
Yeah,
between the two?
it's both. It's definitely both. I grew up hunting, backpacking, fishing since I was little. That's kind of what I always did. That's what helped develop my interest in wildlife. But in the U.S., to then briefly talk, professionally, yeah, some of my research does interest me, or I am interested in conducting research because of hunting. And a lot of that has to do with in the U.S., as you might be familiar with, but if listeners aren't, it's the North American model of wildlife conservation, where in the U.S. they're tied hand in hand, right? And so our state wildlife agencies are all funded by the tags and licenses purchased by the public to hunt and fish. And so, we're not getting, or our state agencies aren't getting tax dollars. Their whole operation is being funded by licenses, hunting and fishing license sales.
Yeah, it's a Pittman-Robertson Act, if I remember correctly.
That's separate now. Yeah. Oh. So so there's a couple things. Your first is your all license hunting and fishing licenses. All that money goes back into the state agency and runs it. And then you have an excise tax on all hunting related equipment, so firearms, ammunition. There's some other things, but usually firearms and ammunition is kind of the big one that falls into it. And yeah, that falls with the Pittman-Robertson Act. And so that money is collected by the federal agency and then gets distributed to the state. And then that money can only be used for wildlife conservation, habitat management. So those coffers can't be raided by the state legislature to try and shore up debts in different areas. Uh-huh. And then we also have the Dingell-Johnson Act. And the Dingell-Johnson is the same thing as hunting, but it has to do with like fishing. So it's excise tax on like boat fuel or petrol and various other kind of water fishing related equipment. And that's the same thing. Those money then get distributed to the states. So it's kind of, there's multiple sources of funding, but yeah, it all comes from hunting and fishing dollars or license sales, and then small taxes placed on hunting and fishing related equipment.
Yeah. No, and again, this is something that I we talked in the podcast many times, that American model of wildlife conservation is probably as good as it gets. It's probably the best in the world in sense of how to fund and how get money from people who are on one hand interested, being channeled into wildlife conservation and so on. Okay, listen, Matt. So let's switch the gears now a little bit, and let's talk about black bears, because I'm just waiting to talk about, obviously, bears is like probably my one of my favorite terrestrial, predatory mammals, and I even obviously black bear is specific to America. I even was back in Poland and in Ukraine to photograph and observe the brown bears, but the black bear is a little bit different. So can you explain to us and to me, like what is a life history of that animal, how it differs from brown bears, and like all those basic things about black bear?
Yeah, for sure. So the black bear is one of 8 species of bear in the world. The American black bear evolutionarily is one of the more recent ones. So bears in general are the Ursidae family, so ursids. radiated from Asia over into North America. And so the American black bear split from the Asiatic black bear at some point coming over to North America. And then from there, from the American, the grizzly and the polar bear split off, and then the polar and grizzly bear split off.
Oh.
And so the polar bear is actually the evolutionarily the youngest bear species.
Oh.
And the American black bear is unlike, I guess, the polar bear, but like most bears, it's highly omnivorous. So most of its food is going to be coming from non-meat based food sources. So primarily the diet of a bear kind of, a bear is dictated by its stomach and its nose. And so what it eats is kind of going to be highly dependent on the availability of food at that time. So they're going to get out of the den from hibernating. They've spent anywhere from 4 to 7 months just sleeping, not eating, not urinating, not defecating. And they're going to lose anywhere from 20 to 40% of their body weight. And so when they come out of the den, they're going to be super hungry. But the only thing that's going to be available is probably either green grass, or if they can find carrion, winter kill carcasses. And so the primarily will start off eating grass, and then they'll start shifting towards various berry producing plants come summer into the fall. And then once they get to late summer to early fall, then they start switching. In some areas, it depends on the species present. They switch to hard mass, so like acorns. They'll switch over to acorns. They'll also switch over to, like in the Southwest, they'll switch over to juniper berries, and then get fat enough, then they go back into the den and sleep for another 4 to 7 months.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting because, I had this conversation some time ago, like in Europe, there's more bears than wolves. And like how does it happen? Like a bear is this big animal. It's like, yes, but bear can, like I said, eat grass or some other stuff, right? Why wolf eats meat, period. There's no other. Although I saw a footage recently, wolves eating berries as well, but it's just like a, I guess.
Yeah, it's not the primary. Yeah, you have to think. As you go up the food chain, you lose energy as you go away, because you're not perfect or 100% efficient in converting or using all the energy in the food source below you, right? So you have the sun, and you get all this plant matter, and that goes into a smaller subset of ungulates or herbivores, and then that goes to a smaller set of omnivores, smaller set of carnivores, or something with that effect. So you're not having a 100% transfer or efficient transfer of energy from one trophic level to the next. And so thus with bears, they can use more food sources. So there's more there for them, depending on their life history. They can maybe sustain higher abundant populations than something like a pure hypercarnivore, like a mountain lion or a tiger or something like that.
Right. And listen, so your research was related to black bear distribution. And can you explain, like, can you tell us, like, how does it look like? I even haven't known that you were working on occupancy models.
Oh yeah. Yes. So the distribution of black bears. Well, so the American black bear is it's a forest obligate. So getting back a little bit to life history, it's a forest obligate. So the black bear evolved in North America. It continued to evolve during the Pleistocene, along with some of the other kind of crazy bears at that time, like the short-faced bear, the North American spectacled bear, as well as the grizzly. So, quick side note: in the world, we have the brown bear. In North America, we have a subspecies of the brown bear, which we term the grizzly bear. So they're the same bear; it's just a different subspecies. So they also had the grizzly bear, and the grizzly bear evolved on the plains or the wide open country, and this kind of shows the behavior of grizzly versus a black bear as well. And so the way the niche that the black bear filled to survive competing against these other three bears was to be highly specialized in the forest. And so they have shorter claws, so maybe 1.5 inch long claw that allows them to climb trees, versus a grizzly bear is going to be 2 to 4 inches long. And the grizzly bear is going to use their claws as like a garden rake or a garden tool or implement, so they can dig up tubers and roots and flip over rocks and stuff like that pretty easily. The other interesting thing is, because black bears, they're probably the smaller species, they ran away when they were confronted or got into a situation with another bear. And so, for example, in North America, you'll often hear people say, "Oh yeah, black bears, they're just big wimps. They'll just run away from you. They're more scared of you than you are of them." Which, there's some interesting insight. If you ever get involved with a grizzly or black bear, depending on what they can do, there's some scary stuff. Well, black bears, they did flee, and so if you do see one, they often do run away. In grizzlies, since they could climb a tree, and when the grizzlies, because it was out in the plains, there weren't trees to climb up, their reaction was to attack you, charge you, maul you real quick, and then run away, right? And so that's why they kind of get that reputation. They have that behavior of being, very aggressive, and you don't want to mess with the grizzly, which you don't. They're massive animals. It's interesting how their evolutionary history has led to kind of their reputation today.
I even heard somewhere that there is this saying, I think, that with play dead when the grizzly and when the black bear, right, whatever that is.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is, I don't remember what I read it or someone told me, is like you said, the grizzly attacks you, but really doesn't want to eat you. It is just its way of neutralizing threat.
Right.
So when you play dead, it kind of doesn't have a threat anymore and will leave you. While black bear, where black bear is attacking you, then he seizes you as a food. So you have no choice, and you have to fight back, even because, like I said, they usually just back off. But if they're not backing off, then they're actually trying to predate on you, and that's why you're just playing that not gonna work.
Right. Yeah. So grizzlies, they see a threat, they try and maul it, neutralize the threat. If you're still moving or messing with them, then they might maul you again. Black bears, they tend to run away, but there have been instances where people hiking have had black bears kind of keep circling them, and that's sort of this predatory behavior. And in that case, the black bear is looking at you as a potential food source, and so it's trying to predate or kill you. And so in that case, you may want to fight, or you probably want to fight, try and find a big stick or rock or something and be ready for that. So it is a common saying, although my solution for either is to carry bear spray with me no matter what.
Yes. Are you often hunting in the bear country?
Yeah. Yes. Archery. So in the U.S., well, I mean, a lot of places, and it depends on where you're at in the U.S., but for example, in Montana, or in the U.S. in general, if you're hunting elk, or which I guess not European elk, American elk. So not red deer, I think is the
Yeah,
like
like red deer is a kind of similar but different species than elk.
Yeah, so I think the red deer
Is
is
smaller, has a different antlers a little bit.
Yep,
But
Cervus
then
elaphus, and then
yes,
Cervus canadensis is what ours is.
yeah, but then to make things even more complex, in the countries like, for example, Norway, they
Oh,
calling
that's
a
where it is. Yeah,
moose, calling
yeah,
a elk. It's like
yeah. That's what I was thinking. Yeah. So the American elk, the one that's a light brown body, a dark chocolate neck.
yeah,
Their mating season occurs in late August and into October, with September being the kind of the peak rut. And so that's a popular time for archery season, because you can call in elk, you can bugle, you can cow call, and you can call males in. So you have these really cool interactions of them, bugling. And archery obviously has a less effective distance than you would with a rifle. Well, there have been there have been cases, and it's definitely a concern in areas of grizzly country. You have to be extremely careful with grizzly bears trying to take those carcasses from hunters. It's bears will often, it's called kleptoparasitism, where bears will steal the kills from other carnivores, and it happens a lot with bears and mountain lions. A black bear will steal a kill that a mountain lion made, and so it's kind of a similar thing. If a grizzly will hear a gunshot, or if they smell a carcass, they'll go to that area, they'll find the carcass, and they'll either, depending on how fast this occurs, push the hunter off, or oftentimes you butcher the animal and you are packing it out and you have to make multiple trips, or you have to wait overnight, and they'll come back and they'll find that carcass, and then they'll sit on it and they'll try and keep it. And so yeah, it's definitely a concern when you're hunting in grizzly country. That is a huge concern. Hunting in black bear country, again, it's kind of has to do with their behavior. They're not as aggressive. They are pretty scared of folks, and so people don't. It's not nearly as a concern, but there is concern that a black bear or a coyote or a wolf, depending on where you're at, could scavenge the carcass. And so oftentimes what you'll do, if you are in heavy bear country, you might cut it up, put it in bags, and then string it up into a tree high enough so they can't get it. And then if you have to come back the next day, what we do is we'll try and make sure we can approach the carcass from a place that allows us to kind of see it from a distance. We'll make a bunch of noise, and we'll try and, look ahead to make sure there's, nothing on the carcass when we get back.
Right. It's interesting because I thought it's mainly situation when you actually leave the carcass, when the bear tries to climb it. But you're saying that they actually actively can just go in and try to.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah,
and they're smart animals, so I guess they probably know that when they hear the gunshots, it's like, oh, dinner.
Yeah, no, that's I think it's been shown in a study, but don't quote me on that. But I think they've at least looked at given hunters GPS units, and then having collared bears, and have seen that during hunting season, grizzlies will know that a gunshot means a food source on the landscape, and they will kind of go towards that area because there's a 500, 600, 700 pound or a 1,000-kilo animal on the ground, and there's guts, there's organs, there's meat, there's a lot of calories, especially with it being the fall. They're in this mode. So bears, when they're feeding, when they get into the fall, they go into a feeding state called hyperphagia, where they used to be more active in dawn and dusk, and they have their normal home ranges, and they're kind of feeding, and when they go into hyperphagia, they kind of increase their activity levels, and they will just go crazy, just eating nonstop. and they'll increase their, calories from, I think it's something like 6,000 or 8,000 calories a day to 15 to 20,000 calories a day.
Whoa.
Yeah. And so when it gets to be that fall time, and they're, those last few months can kind of be the, make it or break it as to whether or not they make it through the fall, or even they reproduce. That's another thing we can talk about. So they can get pretty aggressive when they're trying to, either steal or defend a kill.
Wow. And is there, so in some states, or I don't know, you can, this is actually question, in how many states you can hunt bears, black bears, brown bears? Because in some you can, some you can't. And I know that there's even some controversy, like usual in those things, about some jurisdictions. I even read somewhere that some one of the jurisdictions kind of back off from they plan to ban black bear hunting, but then they didn't. And then somewhere else that it is banned. So can you kind of explain to us that situation?
Grizzlies, that's the easiest one to explain. You can hunt grizzly bears in Alaska. They're not considered endangered there. But in the U.S., you cannot hunt grizzlies anywhere. They are still, or I guess since I've the yellow, so there are Yellowstone, Continental, Cabinet. I think there's 5 or 6 recovery zones for grizzly bears in the U.S. And I think grizzlies in the itchy eye. The one of the larger units, it's called the Northern Continental Divide Ecosystem. It's northwest Montana, Canadian border. I believe they've been delisted from the Endangered Species Act, whereas the Yellowstone area, the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, those grizzlies in that recovery area have not been delisted. And then there's no grizzlies functionally no grizzlies in recovery area in Washington and in a recovery area in central Idaho. And then the last 2 recovery areas in northern Idaho and northwest Montana are small, and those bears are still endangered. So the recent push now is to try and get the bears from the Yellowstone ecosystem, to have them delisted. And so the state agencies in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, if those bears do get delisted, they are considering having hunting seasons for them. It would be only a few individuals each year, and part of that is one things I'm interested with wildlife and hunting is trying to provide this opportunity of having harvest of a species while still a sustainable harvest where you still have populations into the future.
Yeah, and this is kind of important to stress, especially for significant portion of my listeners, that when we talk about delisting, let's say brown bears and allowing hunting, it is, like you said, very controlled hunting, very controlled number of animals I presume in a very specific time of the year.
Yep.
Because quite often when you say like, oh, you can hunt, people in their head have this like, oh, now there's a bunch of people, with guns shooting everything that moves. So that still is.
Yeah, and I think that's something, in wildlife you kind of discuss different types of animals, and you have your ecosystem engineers like beavers. They change the ecosystem and they provide all these benefits. You have umbrella species that they require such a large area or diverse habitat composition that conserving them serves as an umbrella for everything underneath it. And then you have also these charismatic species, and these are often your cute and cuddly species that demand or gain a ton of attention from the public. And so you might think of things like sea otters or wolves, grizzly bears, eagles. Bald eagles are very popular, golden eagles. And so that often, people, because they like them so much, they don't like seeing them being harvested through hunting or seeing them hunted at all. But oftentimes, you'll have a lot of other species that either are hunted and there's no issue with them. Like you can hunt deer, elk, moose, pronghorn, tons of different birds, including, ducks and geese and pheasants and quail. And then there's other animals that, don't have an actual season on them for a lot of places. And so, yeah, I guess the thing I'd like to point out is that, in the US, part of the North American wildlife model conservation is that these populations are managed using the best available science. And so our agencies are trying to, manage those populations using science. For example, like my first chapter of my dissertation, they had a study done in the 90s that estimated density of bears in mountain ranges. They used those to set harvest limits. And then after, 10 years or so, they go, you know what, we should probably get a new fresh look at these populations to see how they're doing. Let's start a study. And so they funded my study. And then, the nice thing is they then, allowed us to act independently. And so we went out and collected these data. We're not, for us, we weren't interested in how this affects the harvest limit. We don't care if it means less or more or stays the same. We just want to provide high quality science that provides the management agency with the information they need to then manage the population. And so, yeah, my first chapter, I published it. Those estimates went to the Game and Fish Agency. They presented it to the State Game Commission, who approves the laws recommended by the state agency. And that got implemented, and that affected, how many bears could be harvested. It increased in some areas and decreased in other areas, or stayed the same.
Right.
Yeah.
So great work. And this is I guess the chief thing that is missing, I feel, in a lot of implementations, like where I live, the lack of science and the lack of knowledge, and it always breaks me up when I hear those conversations about, how, whether we should call badgers or whether we should kill deer or whatever. And, or even other subjects that I covered quite a lot in the podcast is a conflict with seals, where some groups are calling for seal cull and some, they're protected. And for me, it's absolutely it's always first question is like, how many do we have? What is the population? What is population dynamics? And unfortunately, usually the answer is like, we don't know. We don't know how many is and this is the big problem. Listen, so let's come back for a second, still to black bears. So how the black bears are doing overall?
They're doing great. Black bears are expanding. So, they're expanding into areas that they were extirpated from with European colonization. And so, they live in forests. So essentially where you have forest is where you more than likely have black bears. In North America, in Canada, Alaska, that whole northern section, boreal forest, that all has black bears. In the West, we more or less have black bears in all states have black bears. California, Idaho, Washington, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Wyoming. We have black bears everywhere. And then back east, we have black bears in the Northeast. The Southeast is a little bit different. There's so many people there that it's, we have populations that are isolated. Some are expanding. I would guess that's kind of the area of conservation, or not area conservation, the area where you still worry a little bit about black bears is probably in that southeast corner of the United States. And that's because they were extirpated, and now it's black bears recolonizing rather than being reintroduced. But you do have bears in like the Ouachita Mountains of Oklahoma and Arkansas. You have them in Georgia and Florida, Louisiana, East Texas, Kentucky, Tennessee. So black bears are doing really well in North America.
Listen, and so we talked a little bit about encounters with bears when you're actually out hunting, right? But then that's what you expect. You're out there, you're hunting, you're, kind of, that's place where bear lives. Is there much of the conflict with bears, human wildlife conflict with bears, whether with farming interests or I think that everybody saw those pictures, black bear coming to scavenge on the trash can and stuff like that. Is this a so I suppose I have two questions. Like, is this a problem? Is this a significant problem that is maybe growing? Maybe like what's happening? Because I heard about certain areas where it's like a lot of black bears. Really, this is huge population, and then whether hunting is perceived as a way of mitigating that conflict, or there are other ways. Because like, I think for you and for people living in America, this is quite obvious through all the stuff that we discussed. How hunters and hunting interests feeding into conservation and population control in some ways. While again, where I sit, it's always I'm always disappointed where you talk about management of the population or call or something, and this is done by actually taking money from taxpayers and paying service or sharpshooters or whoever who goes, and it's like, why you do this? You have a lot of people who would like to do this and would pay for the privilege to do that, and then you always have this argument, oh yeah, but they're doing that for fun. That's wrong, right? It's like, is it this question, like, if they were hating doing that, would that then be better? Like, is it so?
Yeah.
How that situation look like, especially in the perspective of black bear?
Yeah. Conflict's a huge issue with black bears. You have it for any given reason. You have black bears that come into towns and they know when the garbage pickup schedule is, and they will
just like the Grizzly know where the shot goes off. Yep. These guys know where the
They do. They know when garbage cans are put out, certain nights, and they'll go hit those neighborhoods. They'll hit bird feeders, chicken coops, barbecue, pet food that's left outside. People might have a fruit tree in their yard. And so there's a lot of measures to try and reduce those sources of conflict. So like where I went to school, we had programs to go out and pick fruit trees in people's yards. And then it was called the Great Bear Foundation. And we would press the apples into cider and then sell the cider or give the cider away or use it to raise funds and stuff like that. Tell people to bring in their stuff at night, or no bird seed during the summer, just keep it during the winter. And then agricultural wise, yeah, you do have some conflicts. You have bears that'll get into a chicken coop. And in some parts of the country, you have actually with tree production, with tree farms, you'll have bears that'll go and they will, destroy trees because they're trying to eat the camber in the tree, and they'll tear them up. And so, if you have a private company that owns land to try and log for lumber, that can be a huge, loss of money for the company. And so wildlife agencies here, we have entire biologists dedicated to trying to reduce human conflict. And usually the efforts are focused on the humans, because they're the ones that often cause it are the ones that can help fix it. They're the ones that can put garbage cans in the garage, or when they're out camping, string their food up in a tree rather than keeping it in their tent or in their car, stuff like that. And from there, there's a few things that when you do have conflicts that are done, we have sometimes bears are, there's like a 3-strike rule where if they'll get picked up once, put an ear tag in them, and they might move them, 100 miles away in a different forest or something like that. And if they get in trouble 3 times, then the bear will be ultimately killed. That's usually not as popular with the public, but a lot of the research has shown that, kind of there's a saying, a fed bear is a dead bear, that once they realize that they have easy sources of food by going in and hitting garbage and bird seed, then why would you do anything else when your entire, drive as an animal is to get as fat as possible so you can live through the winter? And so some of the research has shown that these bears, when you translocate them, you relocate them to new areas, they just go right back to where they came from. They go to a new area and get in trouble. Or it's kind of like me, picking you up, blindfolding you, putting you to sleep in Ireland, and then bringing you here to the US and just dropping you into a random city and say, okay, you need to go figure out where you can get food, where you can safely sleep, where you can, plus you have to deal with dangerous people who are already living there and don't like you. And so that's the kind of same thing with bears. They're not as territorial as, say, like wolves are, or hard boundary. Here's one pack, here's the other pack. They do overlap, but they don't like to be around each other. And so you do have mortality sources from there if you dump a bear in a random area and they don't have a home range already set up. So hunting can serve as a tool, and it does serve as a tool in some areas, because a lot of times, how many animals we want is either dictated by, do we believe the habitat can handle it, or is it socially acceptable, right? People might like to have black bears, but they may not want to have so many black bears where, it's the whole town has them all over the place. And so you can use hunting as a tool to try and keep populations at a certain level to where people find it socially acceptable to have that many, because there's not so many where they're getting in trouble or they're, threatened or some factor. Now, one aspect that I think is ignored is that you could, with bears, you can keep them at a certain population level with hunting and may have no issues, or they could be at high population levels and have no issues with the public, with conflict. What happens, though, is when the bear's food source, so oftentimes in years of drought, you won't have berries produced, or that many berries, or not enough acorns, and bears prefer their natural foods. When you have droughts, you have failure in these different soft and hard mast crops. Bears will move out of those areas that are in a drought, and they will, start traveling wider range to try and look for food. And that's where we say the most conflict is, because now they're going into town trying to look for food, and people have watered yards and lawns that might have, ornamentals that have food. They have garbage cans, they have bird seed, they have pet food. They might have fruit trees, they have gardens, they have chicken coops. And so it acts as they have no food out in the forest, and now there's food in the city. Well, they're going to start heading down into it. And that's where, even if you have a low abundance or a high abundance population, you're going to have conflict in those instances.
Right. Listen, overall, how would you say that hunting has like a big problem with public perception, and it's kind of is in a decline, or you see maybe more education is needed in terms of how that feeds into the wildlife conservation, and because in general, which I think it's a good trend, that people start to be more aware of the environment. People start to be more aware of the climate change. People start to be more aware of the biodiversity laws, et cetera, et cetera. So these are good things. And I think that even pressurizes policymakers on, making correct moves. But at the same time, intentional or non-intentional casualty is hunting, where it is more perceived as a threat to biodiversity and wildlife and so on, rather than an element that goes hand in hand. And similarly, and I even wrote a blog about it, and similarly, hunters quite often are perceived not as an allies in work on protecting habitats and conservation and so on. They're by general public, they're perceived as enemies of animals. Oh, they want to kill all the animals. How I'm just curious about your comments, and especially from the perspective of United States, where you live. How does that look for you?
Yeah, a lot of things related to that. I think one of the things to remember is sure there's always a few people in there that don't represent the views of the majority of a group or something. And I think with hunters, they don't necessarily, like, for example, I don't enjoy, or I don't find killing an animal fun, right? That's not, when I go hunting, the shot is the last thing on my list of why I like to go hunting. I like to go hunting because I get to explore new areas, new landscapes. I get to see things that I never do just sticking on a trail or only going in the nice times of the year. I get to interact with wildlife. I have to learn the behavior and the ecology of a species. I have to try and think like a predator does oftentimes, like, well, how can I camouflage myself, or how can I trick this animal into not knowing I'm here? And and I also view myself as being part of the ecosystem. I think that's another thing, is a lot of times folks view humans as being dirty, as being separate from animals. We should be in our city, animals should be outside of the city, and that's it. We need to have this barrier of us and them. And I very much don't view that. I view that as we are all connected in one, and it, and part of that kind of drives why I care about wildlife. I see them as intrinsically valuable just because I like to see them. I like knowing they're out there, but I also know they have, uses for a number of things, whether that's I can get my own meat. For example, I don't buy beef anymore, mainly just because I harvest all my meat. I can shoot an elk, I can shoot a deer. In New Mexico, we have oryx. I harvested an oryx, a couple of years ago. And so I like knowing where I can get my meat. And I know that when I eat a steak or cook something, I remember those. I have those memories from that hunt, and every time I look at it, I go back to like everything that occurred up until the point of me getting, or even after. Like, some crazy stuff has happened when I'm packing the elk or the deer or whatever on my back myself in the middle of the dark, right? Some of the best friendships I've had have been made over those hunts. So in that sense, I think that's maybe a difference that folks don't maybe know about when it comes to hunting, is that I think hunters very much value they value all of this, and so they inherently value the animal for providing those opportunities. And then the other thing is, hunters don't always want to kill everything. That does, we have seen that in the past with market hunting. And that's kind of what drove the North American model of conservation. We said, hey, animals shouldn't be used in markets. So you can't shoot an elk and then go sell that meat. I know in some places, I met a researcher from Sweden where he has harvested, a number of moose, and they sell moose meat every year, which is really interesting to hear. But from a North American perspective, it's kind of like, wait, what did you just say? You can sell your moose meat?
Yeah, same thing.
Totally
same thing here. You have the whole these game processors where you actually hunt and just drop the carcass in the game processor, and then it there was a lot of like a press releases like because of the pandemic and the less hunting opportunity and so on, how the venison prices were affected and stuff like
crazy.
That. Yeah. So
here, pandemic wise, hunting and fishing just skyrocketed. The number of licenses sold, just spiked because it was the one thing that everyone could do. They could go out and they could fish and they could hunt. And part of that is that in the U.S. with that model, the wildlife is owned by the public. And so, everyone has this sense of I guess, not ownership, but responsibility because they are a part of that. And so, with hunting, that is one of, I guess, the negative things about the North American model is that since it is based off hunting licenses and fishing license sales, we have seen a drop in funding because of that. The number of hunters is dropping, and that's a huge thing. And there's been some big talks about trying to do, a similar tax. We call it the backpack tax.
Yeah.
The REI tax. Well, we have an excise tax on hunting and fishing equipment. What about all the non-consumptive users, I guess is what they call them? So people that go bird watching or photography or hiking or whatever. Why don't we put a small tax on those equipment to help fund wildlife conservation as well? Because, a lot of people say, you guys just manage wildlife for hunters and that's all you do. And the hunters will say, yeah, but we're the ones that are putting up the money for this kind of thing. So, so it's interesting. That's been shot down. I guess pun intended. That's been shot down quite a bit. The backpack tax has not been enacted. So
this is good. This is interesting because I was probably almost a year ago at this point, we're talking about trophy hunting in Africa and how trophy hunting, right? And I was talking with a scientist, and for the first time he gave me good. So he said, like, I think we should transition that conservation model in Africa away from trophy hunting as quickly as possible. And obviously I was expecting to, the usual, because you shouldn't, and, these animals and so on. And there was nothing like, he said, because the number of hunters are dropping, and that's simply, the funding will dry out. And to me, that was like, for the first time, the best argument why it makes sense to transition away from hunting, because this is providing, obviously me being me, I said, like, well, why don't we promote hunting and get more hunters so we can sustain the conservation model? But it's interesting that you kind of mentioned the same thing.
Yeah. And, I think the pandemic has really shown that we can't do one or the other. There's some folks that I follow on Twitter that they are huge in the African trophy hunting conversation. Amy Dickman and Adam Hart. They're actually UK based, I believe.
Yeah.
So
I think that was Adam Hart who made that argument.
Oh,
on my
interesting.
podcast. Yeah, I had him twice. So that was like for the first time, I was like, that is a good
Yeah,
argument why we should
but
transition.
now we see with the pandemic, well, people couldn't travel, and so phototourism tanked because people weren't allowed to go. And so it's kind of, putting your eggs all in one basket type of thing. Like maybe we should have a diverse portfolio of ways we use to fund habitat or wildlife conservation. And so in the US, because we are heavily based on those license sales, we have this program called the 3R initiative, and that is to promote the recruitment, retention, and reactivation of hunters. And oftentimes it was promoted towards trying to get more kids into hunting because the hunting community is just getting older and wider. So let's get a diverse set of hunters across the nation. Well, then what the hard part about recruiting kids into something like this is they don't necessarily make all the decisions as to what hobbies they can or can't do, right? You have to also convince the parent, and you have to convince the parent to buy them equipment, take them out, or have a mentor take them out to hunt. And so there's also, which, with this shift towards trying to be more conscientious about where your food is, reduce your carbon footprint, there's a shift towards kind of locavores, supporting local farmers, growing your own food. And so actually a big part of this initiative has actually been trying to identify people that are 20 to 40 years old they have disposable income. They are, interested in trying to acquire food that is, that is ethically sourced, that is, free of various chemicals, whether it's, hormones or antibiotics or whatnot, as well as trying to reduce your carbon footprint. So if you can avoid getting a cow shipped from Argentina, and instead you can go 20 minutes out to your local forest and harvest a deer, then why wouldn't you do that? And so that's been a huge push in the US as well. And it's one that I really like to see because that's something I love being a hunter and an angler is that, for example, right now, I have oryx meat or gemsbok meat from the animal I harvested in New Mexico. I have a deer that I harvested back home in Montana. I have bluegill and perch fish that my significant other and I just went out and caught ice fishing a couple weekends ago. We have, there's ramps or wild onion or huckleberries or all these things that we go out and pick on our own and incorporate into our food. And it's just really cool trying to pair local meat and local vegetables, and you get kind of more interested. And I feel like you become a much more of a naturalist in that sense, because now you're walking out and you're thinking like, oh, there's some ramps, I could pick those. It's like a garlicky spinach almost. And like, oh, here's huckleberries, I can make a pie with that. And so that's one aspect that, I guess non-hunting community doesn't get to experience. It's just that local connection or that personal connection you have with your food. In that when I make a dinner, I know exactly where this came from. I can tell you what it was eating. And I can also tell you that that this animal wasn't harvested lightly. I waited until there was a shot that a shot was provided that could mean a quick ethical kill. Stuff like that. And so hunting is much more than just the kill. It's everything else leading up to the kill and after the kill. I mean, I'm still thinking about that meat a year later after it was, harvested.
Yeah, I think that every hunter who listens to that knows exactly what you're talking about, because this is exactly it. Listen, Matt, we're gonna be wrapping this thing up. I just want to ask you one last question. With everything that's going on with natural environment, with nature, with climate change, biodiversity laws, sixth extinction, etc., etc. How do you think this will play out over next 50, 100 years? Are we, delaying the inevitable? Is there only way of, saving wildlife and wild places is kind of to scale back our human activities, or perhaps innovation is the way forward? How do you see this playing out?
On the human side, I think we need to embrace innovation that helps reduce our footprint, the number of resources we use, everything associated with that. But we also, those things can only do such a good job, or can only perform to such a high quality, or such a level. It's inevitable, and I think it's been shown in a number of papers that we as humans also need to start adjusting our lifestyles in a way. Maybe we do need to focus on, reducing, driving, or, maybe we need to not be as consumptive. Everyone loves to recycle, but recycling isn't always used. Recycled material, or the raw material, the bottles you throw away or you recycle, they aren't always used, and some of that stuff isn't always of quality, high enough quality to be used. So it just gets tossed in the landfill, already. And so when it comes to the reduce, reuse, recycle, the number one thing we say is reduce, and recycle is always last. And so we should probably try and reduce what we use, reuse what we have, and then ultimately still try and recycle things. And, that's kind of where the innovation comes from. You see things that are like, oh, this was made from recycled tires, or this was made from recycled cans or bottles. And I think that stuff is great. And we should continuously innovate to try and be better at doing stuff. But ultimately, a pound of prevention's worth, or an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And if we can try and focus on if we can reduce what we use, that allows us to focus our innovation on things to make a world a better place instead of keeping it from getting any worse. I think that would be, my preference, and I think is something we have to start kind of thinking of doing.
Yeah. And you think we have a good chance of doing it?
Yeah, I think we can. I think, I guess I'm more of an optimist when it comes to that stuff. And I think we are seeing people kind of shift back towards being more conscientious about the environment in terms of wildlife habitat conservation. Like, for example, the biggest threat to wildlife is going to be the loss of habitat.
Yes.
We can talk about hunting, and with hunting, the whole premise of it, I guess in a scientific standpoint, is there's going to be a portion of the population that's going to die every year, maybe because there's not enough food, or maybe because, for example, on average, 50% of the nestlings die every year because within the first 6 months. And so the idea with hunting and sustainable hunting is, well, why don't we take the portion of the population that is going to die? Why don't we just have them be taken from the population through hunting instead? And so those are small numbers compared to, if habitat gets lost, whether, it's because, most likely development, right? You can't put animals back in a parking lot. And so I think sometimes, a lot of conversations kind of miss the forest for the trees, and that habitat loss is going to be the biggest number one thing we have to kind of worry about. And so that, requires us to maybe think about how we build. Should we be expanding out, or should we be building up? Should we, various various things like that. But I think it's possible. I think we just kind of got to get our act together at some point, which hopefully that's starting to turn the other direction now.
Yeah, absolutely. Matt, listen, it was pleasure talking with you. Thanks a lot for that, and I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks, Tommy. Appreciate it.